Now that we understand how asynchronous behavior is handled in AngularJS, it's time to turn to a core utility service that comes with Angular out of the box, and that's the HTTP service. There's nothing complicated about the service at all. In fact, the whole idea behind the service is to make communication between your front-end application and the server super simple and straightforward. Since the HTTP service is in its essence asynchronous, it's based on the deferred and promise API exposed by the queue service that we spoke about. When invoked, the main methods in this service return a promise, which is then up to us to process. Calling HTTP service is very simple. The HTTP service is itself a function, so you can actually call it directly. It takes just one argument, a configuration object, which Angular expects to have some predefined properties such as method, URL, and so on. As I mentioned, it returns a promise, so that's why you can invoke the familiar then method. The only required property of the configuration object is the URL. If the method property is not specified, the HTTP method get is assumed. Another property worth taking a look at is the params property. That property can take an object whose property names become parameter names and their corresponding values become the values for those parameters. The parameter values are automatically URL encoded. If you don't remember what that means, a URL is not allowed to have spaces and other special characters. If the parameter value you're trying to pass to the server contains those special characters, the process of URL encoding replaces those special characters by replacing them with a % followed by 2 hexadecimal digits. Spaces turn into plus signs. The three properties you see on the slide, method, URL, and params, are certainly not the only properties that the configuration object can have. There's a lot more properties for more specific cases, and you can look them up in the Angular documentation that talks about the HTTP service. The arguments that you would pass into the then function are the usual arguments that you would pass into the then function when you deal with a promise. The first argument is a function value of a successful response, meaning a resolution of a promise. And the second value is an error response, meaning a rejection of a promise. Here in the slide, I actually named these functions success and error, but in practice, you could keep them anonymous when you use them in line like this. Probably the most used property of the response object will be the response.data property. That's the property that holds the response body. Now, if Angular detects that the response body contains JSON, it will automatically transform the response body into a JavaScript object using the JSON parser. As I said, the same response object gets returned if an error occurs. However, its data property will probably contain some server-generated HTML page explaining the error message, so it's usually not as useful for our programmatic needs. Before we move on and look at some coding examples, let me warn you to avoid a fairly common mistake. A fairly common mistake goes something like this. If you look at the slide, it starts with declaring a local variable called message as an empty string. Then we call the HTTP method, providing some URL, and then we successfully resolve it, and set our local message variable to the response.data. Then we take the scope object and create a message property on it, initializing it to the value that the message holds. So what would you say is the value of the $scope.message? If you guessed an empty string, you are correct. Why is that? Well, remember that we're dealing with an asynchronous call. The local variable message will not get set with the response.data until after the last line on the slide executes. That last line will set the $scope.message to whatever the value of the local message variable is right now, which is an empty string. So what's the fix? Well, it's actually quite simple. The proper implementation will be to set the $scope.message to the response data directly in the function representing a successful resolution of the promise. The setting of the message on the scope service will then occur only when the data is returned and the promise is resolved. Okay, time to look at some live code examples of what we've discussed so far, and that's what we'll do in part 2 of this lecture.